Gervonta Davis is the current WBA lightweight champion and not too long ago was widely regarded as a top 10 pound for pound star. The lightweight and super lightweight divisions are full to the brim of immense talent, primarily in the United States, meaning there should be plenty of fights for him to take, but instead he's decided to waste valuable time in his career and waste other people's time by holding his belt hostage. So seeing as his career is basically on hold for the time being in terms of fighting credible opposition, I thought now would be a good time to see how good Gervonta Tank Davis's resume really is using the scoring system I've designed. If you know how the scoring system works, feel free to skip ahead to the time shown on the screen. If not, here's how it works.
I'll use my cat as a template opponent. Each fight that the boxer has 3 criteria to satisfy, which will each be scored out of 10. Firstly, level. This looks at the level of the opponent's whole career, including after their fight took place. This takes into consideration their ability as well as their achievements. Secondly, timing. This looks at how informed the opponent was. The closer to their prime, the higher the score will be. The first and second criteria act as a 2-stage test to properly decide the quality of the opponent at the time of their fight. It's worth noting that competitiveness also plays a factor here. The more competitive the fight was expected to be and the more risk for the boxer being evaluated, then the score is going to be higher. Thirdly, performance. This looks at the in-ring performance by the evaluated boxer. If it's a shutout points decision, an early KO, or just a dominant all-round beating, then you're looking at full marks. Competitive fights can still score high performance marks if it was entertaining. Look at the recent Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. fight for example. Benn lost, but I thought he performed extremely well. So in theory, he could still get a high performance score. The level of opposition is not necessarily a factor here. It is still possible to score a 10 for performance against lesser opposition because the average is going to be brought down due to the other scores in this criteria already being low. These 3 numbers then give us one average number which tells us how good of a win it was out of 10. This is done for all the boxers' fights, including draws and losses. The average number for the draw gets reduced by 33%, and the average number of the loss gets reduced by 50%. Once we have all the figures we need, this gives us 3 outcomes which go into our 3 leaderboards. Leaderboard 1 is consistency. All of the individual scores from the fights will be merged together to create one overall average. This is known as the consistency score, which determines the average level of the wins. Leaderboard 2 is longevity. All of the individual scores from the fights will be added together to give a longevity score. This favours boxers that have a large quantity of wins, so if you like an active fighter, you might prefer this way of deciding who you think has the best resume. And leaderboard 3 is overall. This leaderboard is considered the most important by far. This incorporates everything: the amount of fights, the quality of the wins, the quality of opposition, quality of the timing, as well as the performance. To get this figure, we take the average quality of the opposition, plus the average quality of the timing, plus the average quality of his performance, multiplied by the consistency score, plus the longevity score. Here is how the leaderboards are looking on the consistency leaderboard. As you can see, Alexander Usyk is leading the way, Terence Crawford in second, Floyd Mayweather in third, and at the bottom we have Tyson Fury. In terms of longevity, you can see Manny Pacquiao at 1, Floyd Mayweather at 2, and Canelo Alvarez at 3, mainly because they have had the most amount of fights. And as you can see on the overall leaderboards, Manny Pacquiao is also at number 1, Floyd Mayweather at 2, and Canelo Alvarez at number 3, with Anthony Joshua at the very bottom of the pack. The first 16 fights in Tank's career are of little importance due to being against very poor and very forgettable opposition, so as I do with all of my resume deep dive videos, I'll be starting at their first notable win onwards, and for Tank this happens to be from his first world title challenge against Jose Pedraza in January of 2017, all the way up until his most recent fight against Lamont Roach in March of 2025. So without further ado, let's get into it. Tank's career really took off in this fight against Jose Pedraza, and it was the real first test of his career. Jose Pedraza has fallen off towards the latter portion of his career, going his last 5 fights without a win, but in his prime he was a solid champion at super featherweight with notable wins over Andrei Klimov and Stephen Smith. Plus he also became champ at lightweight with a win over Ray Beltran and Antonio Moran. So all things considered, I give Pedraza a 7.5 for level. Pedraza was the IBF champion at 130 pounds when this fight came about, as well as being undefeated, and Tank's opposition before this was pretty poor in truth, hence why they have not been mentioned up to this point.
This was a massive step up for Tank, and he was rightly considered the underdog by bookmakers for a reason. So this timing has to be a 10. This was the career-defining performance from Tank, and not to give any spoilers away for any other ratings later on, but I don't think we've ever seen Tank fight as well as he did in this fight right here. His counters are always fantastic, but his shot selection was phenomenal, and he was scarily accurate, and the final punch that knocked him down was a peach. This is a 10 out of 10 performance. The average is 9.16. Only 4 months later, Tank took on Walsh in the UK, his one and only time fighting outside of the US. Liam Walsh had a dominant career at British and Commonwealth level and held wins against former world title challengers like Andrei Klimov, as well as having a win in the final fight of his career against Maxi Hughes to win the European title, which has aged brilliantly because Hughes is now potentially a world level fighter himself, so I'd give Walsh a level of 6. Walsh was undefeated and in the best form of his life before the Tank fight, achieving the best win of his career against Andrei Klimov in the fight before. This fight also took place in the UK, so Walsh had home advantage. The only negative I'd say is that Walsh was unproven at world level, and Tank had obviously just beaten a solid world level opposition the fight before in Pedraza, so he was a heavy favourite, so I'll give the timing an 8.5. Tank blew him out in 3 rounds with such pure speed, power and aggression. It was more so the shots catching Walsh on the side of the head and his arms that had such ferocity on them. They were bundling him over and bundling him off balance, and the ref decided to stop the fight. It was potentially a premature stoppage, but the gulf in class was obvious here. This performance also gets a 10. This is an average of 8.16. Only 3 months later, Tank took on Francisco Fonseca, who was an unproven contender, and most of his fights were regional level fights, fighting across Costa Rica, Nicaragua and Panama. There's no real wins to get excited about on this resume, so Fonseca can have a 4 for level. He was unbeaten before this fight, but like I said, the opposition he was fighting to get to that point were really poor, so this really seemed like a step in the wrong direction for Tank's career and was more of a keep busy fight. It's also important to mention that Tank came in 2 pounds overweight, which is genuinely just pretty massive in truth, so I'd give this timing a 5.5. Tank officially won this fight by an 8th round knockout, but it didn't really tell you the full story. It was still a dominant performance from Tank. He wasn't in any danger of losing whatsoever, and he won pretty much every round, but the performance itself was just a little bit flat. It was fought at one pace the entire time, and Tank's punch output was just too low. The stoppage itself was a controversial one. Tank definitely caught Fonseca on the back of the head, causing him to go down. I think Fonseca played up to the ref a little bit too much to try and get a possible disqualification win, which obviously backfired because it was considered a KO for Tank. It's an okay performance that can get an 8. This is an average of 5.83. It took Tank 9 months to get back in the ring, and this was for the WBA Super Championship at Super Featherweight. It was essentially a vacant title. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Someone got delegated, Tank got promoted. It's all a bit of a mess, to be honest. Jesus Cuellar had a long career of fighting pretty much nobodies in Argentina, and then managed to break through into the United States and win a world title at 126 pounds against Vic Darchinyan, which is a very, very good win. Outside of that, there isn't much going on his record, so he can have a 5.5 for level. Although Cuellar had fought at 130 pounds before, he was more experienced and more accomplished at 126 pounds, so moving up to 130 to fight Tank can definitely be seen as a disadvantage for him. Cuellar was coming off an 18-month layoff, and before that, he actually lost his most recent fight against Abner Mares. I'd give this timing a 6.5. Tank got the job done in the 3rd round. In round 1, his counters were lightning fast. He hurt Cuellar to the body. Then in the 2nd round, he was being the aggressor. And when the 3rd round came, he dropped him to the body and then ended it with a barrage of punches, an effortless and flawless 10 performance. This is an average of 7.33. Almost a year passes and Tank takes on Hugo Ruiz in February of 2019 to defend his WBA belt for the first time. Hugo Ruiz was a former world champion at Super Bantamweight and also a world title challenger at Bantamweight, so he is clearly very skilled. He never managed to defend his belt due to losing it in the fight directly after winning it. However, there isn't any particular standout wins, so I'm going to give him a level of 5.5. This was the last fight of Ruiz's career, but he was only 32 at the time, but he also did turn pro at 16 years of age, so he was an old 32. He was also moving up in weight from featherweight to super featherweight, but it was more like a 2-weight jump because he only had the one fight at featherweight and was fighting at super bantamweight before this. Although he didn't look undersized in this fight, he wasn't used to fighting at that weight and he wasn't used to getting hit by people that can hit as hard as Tank can, so the timing can get a 4. This was a 1-round demolition job. The fact that Ruiz was technically the smaller man, despite actually being significantly bigger on fight night, I don't know how he ever got down to bantamweight, but that's a different story. I think the fact that he was a smaller man gave Tank the confidence to walk Ruiz down and not respect his power in the slightest. Tank was still trying to counterpunch for the first 2 minutes until he thought, screw it, I'll just let my hands go. It looked like he broke Ruiz's nose because that thing would not stop bleeding and he basically quit on his feet because of it. Again, faultless performance from Tank, so it gets a 10. This is an average of 6.5. Tank's second fight of 2019 saw him take on Ricardo Nunes in July. Ricardo Nunes only won fights in Panama really, with 26 wins and 2 losses at home in Panama, and then in his 6 fights abroad he lost 5 of them. To be fair to him, the opposition he fought abroad were actually decent, so I don't really know where his ability actually lies. I'll give him a level of 4 because I haven't seen anything that makes me think he deserves any higher. Tank was the first of the big names that Nunes has fought and hadn't beat anyone to warrant a shot at Tank's WBA belt, and like I said, it was only the second time fighting out of Panama, so I imagine it was quite daunting for Nunes to fight in front of an American crowd, so I'd give this timing a 5.5. Tank's jab is such an underrated weapon of his. It's potentially even underrated by himself because he can go rounds without throwing it, especially in his more recent fights. He was working behind his jab nicely in round 1, and then in the second round he started to get quite cocky and showboat a little bit with the way he was slipping punches, but it clearly worked in his favour because he rocked Nunes when punching in the clinch and swarmed him, and the ref decided to stop the fight. This whole era for Tank was pretty dominant in terms of his performances, so this one also gets a 10. This is an average of 6.5. Tank rounded off 2019 with his third fight by moving up to lightweight and challenging Yuriorkis Gamboa for the WBA lightweight title. Now, if you saw my Crawford resume deep dive, you'd know I scored Gamboa a level of 7.5. This was a bit of an oversight from me, so I will change his score to an 8.5 because he was a unified champion and only lost because he moved up in weight to a weight that didn't suit him. He could have stayed at 126 pounds and became a legend. So I've given Gamboa an 8.5, and Crawford's score that I gave at the end will be changed to reflect this. Gamboa is 38 years old and his world level days were well and truly behind him, not to mention that he was severely undersized at 135 pounds, but you also need to factor in that this was Tank's first time fighting decent opposition at 135 as well. He did fight at 135 early in his career against weak opponents, but was clearly more comfortable at 130 because that's where his success came. All things considered, I'd give this timing a 7.5. Gamboa maybe won 1 round, he didn't seem like he was in there to try and win. He felt Tank's power in round 2 and went on the defensive, and obviously being a Cuban, his feet were able to get him out of trouble pretty successfully, despite being dropped 3 times. Tank's output again was just so low in this fight. I think it was a good learning fight for Tank, but it's not his greatest performance, so I'll give it an 8.5. This is an average of 8.16. Tank jumped back down to super featherweight to win back the belt he vacated, which was now owned by Leo Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz was a 4-weight world champion, title spanning from bantamweight to super featherweight. He also had signature wins against Carl Frampton and Abner Mares, who are also both fantastic fighters, as well as some other signature wins. I was toying with giving Cruz a 9, but I think it is a bit too excessive, so I've gone for an 8.5, which I think is more suited, but I can definitely be persuaded, so let me know what you think. The only thing stopping the timing of this fight being full marks is the fact that this was at super featherweight and Santa Cruz's success came at featherweight, and Tank had been at super featherweight pretty much his whole career and shown he can even knock people out at lightweight. With that being said, Santa Cruz was still an excellent opponent and this was a competitive matchup, so the timing can get a 9. This was a competitive fight for as long as it lasted. The volume from Santa Cruz and the long combinations caused Tank some issues, mainly due to Tank having the habit of moving back in straight lines when on the back foot. Then obviously Tank got the knockout in the 6th round, and what a knockout it was. This and Povetkin's knockout against White are 2 of my favourite recent KOs of all time. That left uppercut is just so satisfying to see, also known as the Marge Simpson. The knockout deserves a 10, but the performance itself was more like a 9, as he did show some flaws in his game.
This is an average of 8.83. For reasons unknown, Tank then jumped up 2 divisions to super lightweight to fight Mario Barrios, who was WBA champion. As you can tell, the WBA have just let Tank do what he wants at this point. I think he's such a big draw they would just let him get away with murder if he wanted to. Mario Barrios is seen as being a poor champion, especially considering there is a lot of talent around the 135 to 154 divisions. He is still a 2-weight world champion, and I'd give him a 6.5 for level. This was Tank's first time jumping up to super lightweight, and Barrios was undefeated. Barrios was still technically untested despite being champion, so Tank definitely looked for the worst champion he could to get an easy belt when there was plenty of fights to be made in his current weight division. You can call it a cherry pick, I suppose, but he is still jumping up to a new division against someone who was already a big guy for lightweight. One of the main issues here is that there was apparently a rehydration clause, which was confirmed by Barrios himself, but we don't know what the extent of that rehydration clause actually was. I was going to give the timing a 9, but the rehydration clause just takes a point off, so I'm going to give it an 8. Tank started the fight cautiously and took a little bit of time to figure out Barrios, and even after he found the timing in the mid-rounds, Barrios was still winning rounds on volume alone. The judges' scorecards were very pro-Tank, so it doesn't matter that he got the stoppage, but I think this fight was razor close up until it got stopped. But again, the stoppage was very good and he's a lethal finisher, so I'd give this performance an 8.5. This is an average of 7.66. From now on, Tank pretty much turns into a 1 fight a year kind of fighter, with the odd exception. He jumped back down to lightweight to fight Isaac Cruz and defend his belt that he won against Gamboa. Isaac Cruz is one of those fighters that can give anyone a hard time. His style is relentless and he doesn't stop throwing haymakers. He beat Rolly Romero to win a world title at super lightweight, and Rolly is now a world champion, so that wins age very well. And he beat Gamboa quicker than Tank and Bud were able to, so I'd score Cruz a level of 7. Cruz definitely wasn't a very well-known fighter at this point in time, so this turned out to be a high-risk, low-reward sort of scenario in what was actually a late replacement for Rolly Romero, who Tank was originally supposed to be fighting. And from what I understand, Cruz was meant to be fighting on the undercard, but was promoted to fight Tank instead because Cruz and Romero fight kind of similar. They're both forward pressure fighters. But Cruz was meant to be fighting a 10-rounder, so be moved up to a 12-rounder. It's obviously not ideal for him. I'd assume because Cruz was a pressure fighter like Rolly, they thought Tank was going to be able to catch him coming in all night long. This was almost matchmaking gone wrong because it was a very close decision. Tank was a pretty strong favourite with the bookmakers, but Cruz was definitely considered a live opponent still. I'd give the timing an 8. This was a close fight and also a very difficult fight to score. Cruz's defense was very good against Tank's counters, and simultaneously Tank's defense was actually probably some of the best we've ever seen in this fight, especially considering Cruz is used to landing a solid amount in the majority of his fights. It was a close fight, but I wouldn't say it was an off night. Cruz was just better than a lot of people, including myself, expected. There is also the factor that Tank injured his hand early on, so he showed some adaptability, I suppose. I'd give Tank's performance an 8.5. This is an average of 7.83. 6 months on, he takes on Rolly Romero, which will be Rolly's first real test. Romero is the current champion at welterweight, beating Ryan Garcia on the Times Square card, and had a disgusting refereeing decision in his favour to beat Ishmael Barroso to become the world champion at super lightweight as well. Although he is officially a 2-weight world champion, I think it's a bit generous to call him that. I'd give Romero's level a 7. Rolly was young, confident, and an awkward puncher, plus had made quite a name for himself through Floyd Mayweather and the doghouse sparring stories at Mayweather's gym, but many felt he hadn't earned the shot. Still, being unbeaten gave him some legitimacy, and he was also a big puncher, so this timing can get an 8. Tank absorbed some early pressure, but it didn't take long for him to figure Rolly out and begin setting traps for Romero to walk into. The counter left that dropped and stopped Rolly in the 6th was a beauty, and a punch that Tank has used in many of his fights. Some iffy moments in the first few rounds and a slow start stops this from being full marks, but I give this performance a 9. This gives an average of 8. Fast forward 8 months and Tank defends his WBA lightweight title once more against Hector Luis Garcia. Garcia was an undefeated champion at super featherweight, best known for beating Chris Colbert and Roger Gutierrez. I personally think he's a very solid fighter, which was evident in his split decision loss to Lamont Roach, but he needs a few more wins on his record to get a higher rating, but for now his level is 6.5. Garcia moved up to lightweight to fight Tank after a career best year and had a ton of momentum, but Tank had all the advantages in size, power and experience at 135,
so I've gone for a timing of 8. Tank started measured in the first 3 rounds. He gradually took over and started to walk down Garcia. Tank didn't work the body that much in comparison to what we've seen in the past, but Garcia looked pretty gassed by round 7, possibly due to the combination of Tank's pressure and carrying the extra weight that he's not used to. Garcia didn't come out for the 9th round after having a very rough 8th round. It was a solid performance from Tank that I'll give a 9. This gives an average of 7.83. Also in 2023, the highly anticipated matchup between Tank and Ryan Garcia finally happened, but it wasn't for any belt because it wasn't at the lightweight limit and was actually at a catch weight of 136 pounds, which sounds ridiculous to me, seeing as it's only £1, but I'm not a professional fighter, so, what do I know? I'm sure that £1 makes a world of difference. Ryan Garcia is a superstar of the sport, whether you like it or not. He shows glimpses of having immense talent and then glimpses of being borderline useless. I've made a rod for my own back here because the lowest level of world champions usually gets a score of around 6, and obviously Garcia has never won an actual world title, but he more than has the ability to be a champion and a decent one at that. This rating will definitely change in the future, but for now, Garcia gets a level of 7. Other than Tank's first notable fight against Pedraza, this was the one that was considered the most competitive matchup, with Tank only being a very slight -240 favourite with the bookmakers. Now, there is the controversy with Garcia apparently being injured going into the fight with a rib injury, but one thing I will call out is the ridiculous rehydration clause that prevented Garcia from weighing over 146 pounds on fight day. This should be a 10 out of 10 for timing because it was such a competitive, high-profile fight, but that clause really taints things, so I've given it a 7.5. This was a poor game plan from Garcia to come out so aggressive, but you have to give it to Tank. The counter left hand he landed in the second was absolutely identical to the shot he landed on Rolly in their fight. The following rounds were pretty tentative and lackluster. The body shot that stopped Garcia was a nice and well placed punch, but I do believe Garcia when he says he was injured, because I don't think it had enough sting on it to keep him down for a 10 count if he were fully fit. Either way, I've given this performance a 9.5. This gives an average of 8. This is the longest layoff of Tank's career, as it took him 14 months to get back into the ring to defend his belt once again against Frank Martin. Martin's best wins are probably against Michael Rivera or Artem Harutyunian, who are both pretty average, and the only reason most people are aware of Martin is due to fighting Tank. With no great wins and no notable accolades, Frank Martin gets a level of 4.5. Martin was undefeated but a relative unknown entity. This was a mandatory fight for Tank's WBA belt, so no cherry picking going on here, so that's fair enough to him. There was an intended rehydration clause in this fight which was overturned by the WBA, so it never actually took place, but still trying to implement it in the first place is pretty pathetic. I'd give the timing an 8. Martin was probably ahead in my opinion up until round 6, as Tank had a slow start again, as he so often does when he's figuring out his opponent, and the punch stats will tell you that Martin had landed more, but with equalizer power that Tank has, which makes up for his low output, he got the stoppage in the 8th, which was a beautiful uppercut that had Martin out on his feet and then finished him with a straight backhand. It was very reminiscent of Canelo's KO against Kovalev. I'd personally give this Tank performance an 8.5. This is an average of 7. And on to the final fight of Tank's career so far against Lamont Roach. Roach only has the one loss to his name against Jamel Herring in 2019, who was a solid boxer back then. Roach was also a world champion at super featherweight with his only notable win against Hector Luis Garcia. I'll give Roach a level of 6.5 for now, but I suspect this number will go up later on in his career as he is very talented. This was a voluntary defense of Tank's WBA lightweight belt, and the WBA granted an exemption for Roach to challenge for it because he was the WBA champ in the division below at super featherweight. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous if you ask me, but hey ho. So ultimately, it was a voluntary defense against someone from the weight class below. The Tank rightly should have been a massive favourite, so I've given the timing of this fight a 6.5. When I watched this fight live, I put it down to Tank having an off night as well as Roach being better than many expected, but after rewatching all of Tank's fights for the purpose of this resume deep dive, Tank pretty much fought the exact same as he always does, and I think this performance is the result of what happens if Tank doesn't find that big knockout punch. Roach was so patient and countered the counter puncher brilliantly. I felt Roach won this fight. It's not a robbery by any means, so I will accept the draw for what it is, but Tank really was just not good. I think stylistically, Roach is just Tank's boogeyman. I think he's kind of right career-wise to avoid the rematch because I think Roach just has his number. And let's not forget, he should have had a 10-8 round go against him, Tank, for taking that knee. This performance gets a 4.5. This is an average of 5.83. But because this fight was a draw, this average is reduced by 33%, so the actual average is 3.88. Now that we've gone through all of Tank's most notable fights, it's time to look at the results. The average level of Tank's opponents is 6.3, which isn't amazing, but it's actually better than Golovkin's, believe it or not. The average timing of the fights is 7.36. And his average performance is 8.86, which is exceptional, which I'm pretty sure is actually better than Usyk's. His top 5 wins from worst to best are Ryan Garcia, Liam Walsh, Yuriorkis Gamboa, Leo Santa Cruz, and the best being Jose Pedraza. Now it's time to see where this has put Tank in terms of the scoreboards. As you can see, he has achieved a consistency score of 7.37, which is just behind Floyd Mayweather, but just bear in mind, he has had less than half the amount of fights. It tends to be the less amount of fights, the higher the consistency seems to be. You can see this with Usyk and Bud, who are first and second respectively. Usyk has 15 fights, Bud only has 20 fights, so Tank being up there with 15 fights isn't a massive surprise because, like I said, the less amount of fights you have, usually the more consistent your score is going to be because you don't tend to have those warm-up or keep busy fights in between. Tank has achieved a longevity score of 110.67, which actually puts him at rock bottom, which isn't out of the ordinary considering he has had the least amount of fights, or joint least amount of fights alongside Usyk. But even then, Usyk does seem to have a sizable lead on Tank. And the one we've been waiting for, the most important scoreboard, actually sees Tank again at rock bottom. Tank has a score of 276.64, which is only just behind Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury, and he's had 5 fights and 8 fights less than them. He's obviously going to get much better than this. His score is going to improve, providing he doesn't retire anytime soon, but he's only 30. He has still got plenty of fights left, plenty of good fights as well, like I mentioned at the start, plenty of big names for him to fight, and you would expect him to at least win some of those. Realistically now, Tank is ranked outside of the top 10 pound for pound. He's somewhere in the maybe 10 to 15 sort of region, which I think is quite accurate. Considering he's only 30 years old, I do think his resume is extremely good, but with each of his signature wins, there always seems to be a little asterisk or a little caveat to it that it's not always as it seems, such as the controversy with the rehydration clauses, but you can't deny that Tank is probably still the best pure counterpuncher in boxing today. Thank you very much for getting this far and watching all the way to the end. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and let me know who you want to see a resume deep dive on next.